Sometimes a moment is so loud it achieves perfect silence. The world stops, the air crackles, the molecules in the room rearrange themselves. It's not just an entrance, it's a rupture. You could feel it in the air. Chills, chaos, and the loudest pop of the year. Her return just broke SmackDown history. But this wasn't the return of a beloved champion. This wasn't a hero coming home. This was something far more complicated. This was the return of a ghost. A name whispered but never shouted. A legacy so heavy it bends light around it. She wasn't just walking back into an arena. She was walking out of a shadow. A shadow so vast, so dark, and so controversial that the industry had pretended for a decade that she didn't exist. The daughter of Steven Seagal. And as she stood there, bathed in the impossible blue light, the world didn't just cheer. It gasped. Because this wasn't a comeback. This was a reckoning. And the world was not ready. You have to understand what this sound meant. It wasn't just cheering, it was pressure escaping a fault line. For 10 seconds, the broadcast feed clipped. The audio peaked into pure, distorted white noise. The commentators ripped their headphones off, wincing, shouting words that nobody could hear. It was a physical force. It was the collective gasp of 20,000 people realizing the impossible was happening. The lights had gone out, a familiar tactic. But when they snapped back on, the person in the ring wasn't a legend we expected. It was the legend we were forbidden to ask for. She stood motionless. She hadn't aged in the way we expect our stars to. She looked instead like she had been carved from marble, waiting in the dark. And the crowd's roar was a mix of recognition, confusion, and something else. Validation. It was the sound of a million online arguments suddenly ending. The sound of, "What if?" finally being answered. This wasn't just an athlete returning. This was a myth taking a breath. The arena security, trained for riots and intrusions, just stared. They had no protocol for this. You can't stop an earthquake after the ground has already split. And in that moment, as the last echoes of that deafening pop bounced off the cheap seats, a new, heavier silence fell. The silence of anticipation. The pop was the shock. The silence was the fear. What happens now? She didn't move. She didn't wave or play to the crowd or signal for a microphone. She just stood. In the center of the ring, the current women's champion, sweaty and exhausted from the match she'd just won, froze mid-celebration. The champion's confusion morphed, live on camera, into sheer, unfiltered disbelief, then into a cold, professional rage. This was her moment. This was her ring. And now, the spotlight, the cameras, the entire narrative of the night had been hijacked by a ghost. The woman from the shadows just tilted her head, a fraction of movement that felt seismic. She wasn't looking at the championship belt. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking through the champion. It was a look of profound, unsettling indifference, as if the champion, the ring, the entire billion-dollar spectacle was just a minor inconvenience on her path. The commentators, fumbling to regain their composure, tried to find the words. Unprecedented, historic, chilling. But no word captured the violation of reality that was happening. She had been gone for years, erased from the history books, a casualty of the complicated, messy, and dark legacy of her father. She was the one you weren't supposed to mention. And now, she was the only thing anyone could see. The show crashed to a commercial break, not with a bang, but with that terrible, quiet stare. The moment the broadcast cut, the real arena lit up. Not the building, but the one we all carry in our pockets. The internet didn't just break, it evaporated. The platform, formerly known as Twitter, ceased to function, buckling under a traffic spike that dwarfed championship games and political elections. "She's back" was trending, but right below it, the real trend emerged. Seagal. Her name. Her father's name. The narrative was instantly poisoned. It wasn't about her return, it was about his shadow. News outlets, sports blogs, and Hollywood gossip sites all scrambled, pulling reporters from their beds. The headlines wrote themselves, a frantic, chaotic mess of speculation. Seagal's daughter holds WWE hostage. The darkest return in sports history. Why Arissa LeBrock's comeback is a problem for everyone. The conversation wasn't about wrestling. It was about accountability, about legacy, about the sins of the father. Photos of her, stoic in the ring, were placed side by side with controversial photos of him. The media, in their hunger for a story, refused to let her exist on her own. She hadn't said a word, and already they had decided who she was, a provocation. A living, breathing controversy designed to test the limits of cancel culture. She wanted a spotlight, but what she got was a wildfire, and she was standing at the center of it. Inside the arena, the show was over, but no one was leaving. Fans stood in the aisles, staring at their phones, trying to process the digital storm they had just witnessed in person. The euphoria of the pop was gone. It had been replaced by something heavy and argumentative. You could hear it echoing in the concrete concourses. "They can't possibly let her stay, right?" one fan argued. "Think of the sponsors." Another shot back, "She hasn't done anything. Are we really blaming her for him?" Families were split. Fathers tried to explain the complex history to their children, lowering their voices when they got to the why. Why he was a shadow. Why this was so complicated. The joy of the moment had soured, curdling into a moral debate. This is what her return meant. It wasn't fun, it was work. It was an ethical homework assignment nobody wanted. The fans didn't leave that arena buzzing about a great match. They left feeling implicated, confused, and unsettled. They had cheered for a ghost, and now they had to reckon with the hauntings that came with it. The loudest pop in SmackDown history had become the most uncomfortable silence in wrestling. She hadn't just returned to the ring, she had returned to the center of a cultural minefield. Backstage, the atmosphere was glacial. When she walked back through the curtain, that sacred space known as the gorilla position, the usual chaos of producers, agents, and wrestlers stopped. Dead. Sound guys stopped coiling cables. Other performers, waiting for their cues, flattened themselves against the wall. They didn't know whether to applaud or flee. The company's COO was there, his face a mask of forced neutrality, his eyes screaming 1,000-decibel panic. He offered a curt nod, "Welcome back." But the words hung in the air, hollow and fragile. She just walked past him. She walked past everyone. She didn't seek approval. She didn't apologize for the chaos. She moved with the same unsettling calm she had in the ring, as if she were walking through a dream. The champion she had confronted stormed past her, shoving a stage hand out of the way, screaming for her producer, "You better fix this! You better fix this now!" But the woman from the shadows didn't even flinch. She had just become the most powerful and the most toxic person in the entire organization. She was a pariah and a prodigy, and in that moment, nobody backstage knew which one would get them all fired. She was a walking paradox, and the fear she generated was palpable. The women's locker room, usually a mix of competitive camaraderie and chaotic energy, became a tomb. When she entered, conversations died mid-sentence. Makeup kits snapped shut. People found reasons to check their phones, to retape their wrists, to be anywhere else. This wasn't just jealousy, it was contamination. To be seen talking to her was a risk. Would you be seen as supporting her or supporting him? The champion, the actual champion, was holding court in the corner, surrounded by her allies, voice low and venomous. "She didn't earn this," the champion hissed, just loud enough to be heard. "She didn't grind. She didn't bleed for this. She just showed up. She used that name." An uneasy silence followed. The champion was right. but also wrong. She had used the name, but not in the way they thought. She hadn't used it to open doors. She had returned despite it. The locker room was now split. The veterans who understood the business saw her as an existential threat to the stability they had fought for. The younger, hungrier talent, however, they watched her. They saw the fear she commanded. They saw the power in her silence, and they didn't just see a threat. They saw an opportunity. They saw the new final boss. By noon the next day, the company's PR department was in full-blown DEFCON 1. They hadn't sanctioned the return. They had merely allowed it, a desperate gamble for ratings that had already spun out of control. They called an emergency press conference, a sterile corporate affair designed to put out the fire. But it was a trap. The room wasn't filled with wrestling journalists. It was filled with sharks, TMZ, mainstream news anchors, and hard-hitting investigative reporters who hadn't cared about wrestling since the 90s were now here, smelling blood. When she walked out, the room exploded in flashbulbs. She sat, flanked by executives in ill-fitting suits. The first question wasn't about the championship. It wasn't about her time away. It was, "Have you spoken to your father? Does he endorse your return?" She just stared at the reporter. The executive next to her leaned into the mic. "We're here to talk about Friday night." The reporters shouted him down. "Are you prepared to denounce his actions?" Another yelled. "Are you using his notoriety to further your career?" "What is your comment on the allegations?" It was an interrogation. They didn't see an athlete. They saw a proxy. A way to finally get at the man who had hidden himself from the world. She sat through it all, her face impassive, her silence louder than their questions. Finally, she leaned toward the microphone. The room went silent. She took a breath and said, "No. Just, no." Then she stood up and walked out. The chaos she left behind was absolute. That night, she was in an anonymous hotel room, the kind that exists outside of time. The curtains were drawn, the TV was off, the silence was absolute. She was alone, but the room felt crowded. It was filled with the ghosts of the day, the accusations, the flashbulbs, the hatred, the expectations. She had done it. She had returned. She had faced the press. She had faced the locker room. She had faced the world. But she had not yet faced him. Her phone, a simple black burner phone, vibrated on the nightstand. The screen lit up, but there was no name. Just a number. A number from a blocked-off private part of the world. She looked at the vibrating phone, the buzzing sound cutting through the thick hotel silence. It buzzed once, twice, a third time. She watched it, her expression unchanged, as if watching a venomous spider decide whether to strike. The buzzing stopped. The room was quiet again. She picked up the phone, but she didn't call back. She simply opened it, looked at the missed call, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she pulled the battery from the back. She tossed the two pieces onto the bed. The shadow could knock, but she didn't have to let it in. She sat in the dark, not as a daughter, not as a victim, but as a strategist. The world thought this was his move. They were about to find out it was hers. Friday night, SmackDown. The show opened cold. No pyro, no music, just her, already in the ring, holding a microphone. The arena was electric, but this time, it was the electricity of a death row verdict. The crowd was tense, divided, waiting. They needed her to speak. They needed the justification. They needed the soundbite that would let them either cheer her or boo her. They needed permission. She stood, dressed not in wrestling gear, but in simple, stark black. She looked small in the vast arena, yet she commanded the entire space. She lifted the microphone. The silence was so complete, you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. She held it to her lips. The world waited. Would she denounce him? Would she embrace him? Would she cry? Would she scream? What was the answer to the question everyone was asking? Why? She looked down the barrel of the camera, not at the 20,000 in the building, but at the millions watching at home, at the media, at the locker room, at the shadow itself. She opened her mouth, and then she let the microphone fall. It hit the mat with a dull, heavy thud that echoed like a gunshot. The sound of anticlimax, the sound of refusal. She wouldn't play their game. She wouldn't give them the words they craved. She wouldn't be his proxy. As the microphone lay on the mat, she turned her back to the hard cam. She faced the entrance ramp, just as the champion's music hit. The champion stormed the ring, furious, demanding the explanation the world wanted. She was screaming in her face, "You owe us! You owe me!" And for the first time, the woman from the shadows reacted. She didn't attack. She didn't strike. She simply opened her arms. An invitation, a gesture of complete surrender, or perhaps complete control. The champion, confused, stopped shouting. The crowd, baffled, went quiet. This wasn't a return. This was an unstory. We realized in that moment what she was doing. She wasn't here to claim her father's legacy or even to build her own. She was here to erase one. She wasn't back to be Steven Seagal's daughter. She was back to make that name mean nothing. The shadow she was fighting wasn't just her father. It was the industry's obsession with a narrative. It was our obsession. She wasn't back to wrestle the champion. She was back to wrestle the past itself. And by refusing to speak, by refusing to engage, by simply being, she had taken all the power. The world couldn't handle her, not because of who her father was, but because she refused to be him. The pop wasn't a return. It was the beginning of an exorcism.